Okay, so we'll start off with some nice classic Jewish jokes about Israel, Israelis, and Jewish humor. So there's a joke about a Texan visiting Israel, and after sitting in the Negev, gets thirsty, he finds a Jewish house, and he asks the Jewish owner, "Can I have a drink?" And while he's drinking the water, fresh water, he says, "Can you tell me what do you do for a living?" He says, "I'm a farmer. I raise some chickens." He says, how much land do you have?" He says, "Well, I have 50 meters in the front. I have 100 meters in the back." So the Texas gets excited and he starts to boast. He says, "Where I come from, I sit down to breakfast, and then I get on my tractor and I drive and drive and drive. And I won't get to the end of my field until it's already time for dinner." So the Israeli says, "Oh, I also had a car like that." Yeah, so that's joke number one. Joke number two.
Wait, I missed the punchline. You're getting an echo. It's an echo, that's why. When you come closer to the mic, I can hear you much more clearly.
Testing, is this better?
Yes.
Okay.
So what was the punchline? I used to have a car like that?
Punchline, yeah. The Israeli said, "I also used to have a tractor like that."
Oh.
In other words, the Israeli thought, I couldn't imagine such big property. In the little Israel, he's like, he must be referring to his broken tractor. Joke number two is, there's there's a Jew who owns a bagel shop in Manhattan, and the IRS is harassing him about his tax returns. And they said, "How much did you file? How much did you claim you made this year in profit?" He said, "I made $80,000, but I don't understand why you're harassing me so much. Everyone can attest that I work so hard for this bagel shop. My family chips in. We work shifts on and in, and you're harassing me over $80,000. So they said, "No, it's not. What bothers us is not the fact that you claim to earn $80,000. It's the claim that you put 10 trips to Israel as a travel deduction." So he said, "Oh, well, we also include free delivery." Yeah. So that's round of applause. The accountant is laughing. Very good. Thank you, Bruce. Okay. So today we're going to discuss a very important topic, and that topic is about the most modern form of anti-Semitism, at least one of the most prevalent forms in our time. So today's topic is about, let me get back my mouse control, is about the Promised Land. So, historically, we've had many other forms of anti-Semitism, but in our century, one of the most prominent mutations and variants is anti-Israel. Anti-Israel attacks have affected a spike in anti-Semitism. It's a reality. Whenever there's wars in Israel, Jews get attacked in America, in Europe, whether the Jew believes in the policies of the state of Israel or not. And this is a very important topic, especially as the way it relates to our youth. The way our youth understand this topic is very, very important. So we'll start off with a lesson video, and then we'll take it from there.
On the eastern shore of Manhattan Island, the United Nations headquarters rises from a row of colored flags that represent a multitude of nations. Across the avenue, the Isaiah Wall proclaims a Jewish prophet's vision of universal peace. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The UN's mission is precisely that, to resolve armed conflicts and to foster global harmony. But inside the august chambers of the United Nations, founded in 1945 as a response to a war-ravaged world desperate for coexistence, Isaiah could have easily found himself the target of virulent condemnation had he survived into modern times. Isaiah lived in ancient Israel that for over a millennia included the territories that the UN considers illegally occupied by today's Jewish state. The Temple Mount that lies at the heart of Isaiah's prophecy is no longer considered by the UN to be the heritage or possession of the Jewish people. Indeed, the tiny country that Isaiah called home has become the focus of the majority of the UN's denunciations and has inspired more censure than all of today's tyrants put together. Iran, North Korea, and other brutal regimes systematically kill their citizens or deny them the most basic of human rights. Israel's northern neighbor, Syria, has murdered tens of thousands of innocent civilians. Apparently, however, that isn't very important in the eyes of the UN General Assembly and Security Council, who continually pass one-sided resolutions that single out and condemn Israel. An overwhelmingly powerful bloc led by the Arab nations promotes a narrow and slanderous agenda meant to isolate Israel. This agenda has met little resistance. The UN's General Assembly votes on 70 to 100 resolutions annually. 15 to 20 of these regularly express disapproval of Israel. From 2016 until 2020, the Assembly adopted 122 resolutions criticizing various countries. 91 of these targeted Israel. That's 75% of all country-specific resolutions. And while 3/4 of this global forum's written rage lambastes the Jewish state, precious few of the most repressive or blood-soaked regimes on earth have received even a single rebuke. Emergency special sessions of the Assembly are rare. During the last 40 years, they've been convened for one purpose only: to condemn Israel. The Assembly's embrace of a terrorist entity has been equally astounding. In October 1974, 14 years before the Palestinian Liberation Organization even nominally forswore terrorism, the Assembly voted to invite a PLO spokesman to take part in its deliberations. This was the first time that anyone who was neither a government representative nor a head of a quasi-state was granted such a privilege. The following year, the Assembly awarded the PLO permanent representative status. A few months later, the UN infamously approved Resolution 3379, branding Zionism as a form of racism. At the time, Israel's UN ambassador, Chaim Herzog, told his fellow delegates that Hitler would have felt at home listening to the UN debate on the measure.
For us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper, and we shall treat it as such.
Since the 1993 Oslo Accords, hundreds of Israelis have been killed and thousands injured by Palestinian terror attacks. During the same period, the UN passed dozens of resolutions deploring Israel, but not one against the terror attacks. Since the 2006 creation of the UN's Human Rights Council, most of the world's human rights abusers have suffered nary a mild rebuke. Israel, on the other hand, is chastised as often as all of the rest of the countries combined, and in terms more condemnatory. At the Council's every meeting, a topic billed as, quote, human rights situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories is raised as a separate agenda item, while the remaining totality of mankind constitutes a single other point on the agenda. From 2006 to May 2021, Israel was condemned in no less than 94 Human Rights Council resolutions. During the same period, Syria was condemned 36 times, North Korea 14 times, and China has been spared condemnation altogether. Even within the walls of the UN, the absurdity of its anti-Israel bias is fleetingly, partially acknowledged. In September 2006, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan conceded.
Supporters of Israel feel that it is harshly judged by standards that are not applied to its enemies. And too often this is true, particularly in some UN bodies.
In August 2013, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon reflected on Israel's treatment at the UN.
There are some bias against Israeli people and government.
In December 2016, he told the UN Security Council,
A disproportionate volume of resolutions, reports, and conferences criticizing Israel.
one of the more telling comments came inadvertently in November 2013, when a UN interpreter failed to silence her microphone as she addressed her colleague.
I mean, I think when you have 5 statements, not 5, like a total of 10 resolutions on Israel and Palestine, there's got to be something. C'est un peu trop, no? I mean, I know it's yes, it's right, but it's not the. There's other really bad happening. Nobody says anything about the other stuff. Apologies.
Okay, I understand there was a problem with interpretation.
Israel is not larger than 8,019 square miles in total. It is the Middle East's only functioning democracy and champion of human rights. It is a world provider of humanitarian disaster relief and medical, agricultural, ecological, scientific, technological, and security innovations. But when seen through the lens of historical UN bias, the overwhelming majority of all the world's evils and all of the world's ills belong to the tiny Jewish homeland in which Isaiah spoke his vision of swords being beaten into plowshares.
Okay, so that I don't think that video surprised anyone. This idea that the UN is heavily skewed is blatantly obvious. But I want to I think this next piece from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, we've quoted him a few times. He makes this amazing insight. If Joe, can you read for us the first text on text 1? I found this very eye-opening.
What page is that, Rabbi?
This is on page 84.
Yes. Attack on the homeland. The third segment of this course concerns anti-Semitism as it relates to the state of Israel. It is first necessary to clarify why so much hatred centers on Israel and to identify methods of distinguishing between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism that is camouflaged in the language of human rights. We will also explore a distinction between anti-Semitic movements that exclude Jews and those that invite Jews to their ranks. Information that is relevant to understanding and facing opposition to Israel in the broader context of anti-Semitism. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, Future Tech. The new anti-Semitism. What is it and how do we deal with it? Anti-Semitism is not an ideology, a coherent set of beliefs. It is, in fact, an endless stream of contradictions. The best way of understanding it is to see it as a virus. Viruses attack the human body, but the body itself has an immensely sophisticated defense, the human immune system. How then do viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates, and in so doing defeats the immune system set up by cultures to protect themselves against hatred. Most people at most times feel a residual guilt at hating the innocent. Therefore, anti-Semitism has always had to find legitimation in the most prestigious sources of authority at any given time. In the first centuries of the Common Era, and again in the Middle Ages, this was religion. That is why Judeophobia took the form of religious doctrine. In the 19th century, religion had lost prestige, and the supreme authority was now science. Racial anti-Semitism was duly based on 2 pseudosciences. Social Darwinism, the idea that in society, as in nature, the strong survive by eliminating the weak, and the so-called scientific study of race, By the late 20th century, science had lost its prestige, having given us the power to destroy life on Earth. Today, the supreme source of legitimacy is human rights. That is why Jews, or the Jewish state, are accused of the 5 primal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity.
Okay. So to summarize, the hatred of the Jews always seeks legitimacy in the most preeminent power of its time. So in the ancient world, it was religion. So the Christians said we're Christ killers. The Muslims said, the anti-Semites amongst the Muslims said, we don't accept Muhammad as the prophet. Before the Christianity, the Romans, the Greeks, everyone found their packaging, and this took us through the Crusades. Then we had the Nazis, and with the science, the communists, the people that were under the communist rule found, Jews are destroying the communist ideals by keeping religion or whatever Jews were doing that were considered anti-communist and counter-revolutionary, even though they were just being regular Jews. So you always found that outlet in whatever way was necessary at the time. And today, for many, although not all, for those that believe human rights is the highest barometer, the most important thing, this is their vehicle for anti-Semitism. The alt-right doesn't care so much about human rights, so they don't really use this claim. But for people anti-Semites that do care about human rights and see it as the most important ideal, they will use human rights as their vehicle for anti-Semitism. Yes, Stan. Stan first, yeah.
That's one thing I never understood, how they claim that in Israel, that's an apartheid state and they don't consider human rights, but Israel is the only place in the Middle East where people are considered and all religions are treated equal.
We'll get to that. We're going to spend some time on that in this lesson.
Okay.
Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, in the current times, human rights isn't really the issue for the anti-Semites, because most of what comes out, at least what I'm reading in the journals that I get from the Arabs, from the progressives, from anybody that's propagating against Israel, are a bunch of lies. Israel, the apartheid state. Well, if it was an apartheid state, the Arabs in Israel wouldn't have rights. You wouldn't have Arab members of Knesset. You wouldn't have Arab members of.
So one thing that's very important for us to remember is that, first of all, anti-Semitism you shouldn't confuse them with the facts. It just has to have a language of legitimacy. Whether it actually holds the test of water, it actually holds water is not so important to them. And we're going to get into this. We're going to discuss it more and more in this lesson. But the first thing that's very important to ask ourselves, and this is a question I want you to ask yourself, and then we're going to see a poll, which is shown on figure 3.2 on page 87, is which of the following best describes you? Is it A, generally pro-Israel and supportive of the current Israeli government policies? B, generally pro-Israel, but also critical of some of its Israeli government policies? Generally pro-Israel, but also critical of many of the current Israeli government policies? And D, currently not pro-Israel. And it wouldn't surprise us, it's pretty obvious that most Jews have a problem with current Israeli policies. And that's not anti-Semitic. I have problems with the current Israeli policies, and I'm sure many of you as well do, for different reasons, right? So having criticism against Israel is okay.
No
It's
different
fine.
than current U.S. policies having different.
Exactly. No different than criticizing yourself, or different agreements between people, or two Jews, three opinions. That's healthy, and we're not trying to block debate on what's the best approach on how to do things and how to proceed as a country. So that's not what we're trying to squash. So how do you distinguish between what's legitimate criticism and what's anti-Semitism? And the main thing, that's the main determination, whether it's legitimate or anti-Semitic, is if it's a double standard. Let's read text 2 to get us into this. So Joel Verstandig, if you could read, Dr. Joel Verstandig, if you could read for us text 2 on page 88.
88, all right. Double standard. Imicatron wrote to Emperor Hadrian, if it is circumcision, excuse me, if it is circumcision that you hate, Arabian tribes also circumcise. If it is Shabbat observance that you despise, the Kuthians similarly observe Shabbat. Clearly then, you simply hate the Jewish people. Their God will exact punishment from you.
Okay, so the background to this Midrash is that Hadrian was a Roman emperor, and he was very vicious to the Jewish people. And when he received this letter, he was furious by this letter, and he wanted to find out who wrote this letter. He wanted to execute him. And the point of the letter was, you hold a double standard. If you really care about circumcision and Shabbat, which his claims was, we'll get into why he didn't like circumcision and Shabbat. But he said, if you care about this, why don't you target the other minorities in your kingdom that also practice circumcision or keep Shabbat? The fact that you only target the Jewish people tells me, this is the famous double standard test. And in modern context, when there was in the 1920s, there was a Harvard University president, A. Lawrence Lowell, and he didn't want to accept Jews into his college. He said Jews cheat. And when they pointed out to him that other people also cheat, so he said, why are you changing the topic? Now we're discussing Jews. Jews cheat. Don't change the topic here. We're discussing the Jewish people. So when you hold the double standard, that indicates to us that there's that's the key difference between legitimate criticism and criticism motivated by anti-Semitism. And in modern times, Natan Sharansky has developed a 3D test. If we can, Genya, if you can read for us the 3D test on page 89. And then Mike.
Okay, I'm so sorry. The 3D test, this is Natan Sharansky. I believe that we can apply a simple test, I call it the 3D test, to help us distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism. The first D is the test of demonization. Okay. When the Jewish state is being demonized, when Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion, when comparisons are made between Israelis and Nazis and between Palestinian refugee camps and Auschwitz, this is anti-Semitism, not legitimate criticism of Israel. The second D is the test of double standards, when criticism of Israel is applied selectively, when Israel is singled out by the United Nations for human rights abuses, while the behavior of known and major abusers such as China, Iran, Cuba, Syria is ignored. When Israel's Magen David Adom, alone among the world's ambulance services, is denied admission to the International Red Cross, this is anti-Semitism. The third D is the test of illegitimization, when Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied, alone among all peoples in the world. This too is anti-Semitism. It's okay. Pretty much. I did not know that the Red Cross did not allow Magen David ambulances to be a part of it.
Yeah. That's the loan. Yeah.
Throughout the
I mean, this is.
Second World War, throughout
Go
all
ahead,
the
Jeff.
wars that allowed. The Israel just recently was recognized by the Red Cross.
Yeah, this is just one of many examples of double standards. So now equipped with this knowledge, so now we can distinguish. So what are we going to do about it? What can we do to fix this? So number one, our tools that we learned in lesson 1 and 2, which is number one, although God is our ultimate protector, but he puts it in our hands to make a vessel. And therefore we have to do everything we can to protect Israel in whatever ways possible. Reality is about half of the Jewish population lives in Israel. So if Jews there are in danger, whether it's because of Israel or not, it's hurting many Jews. So we have to do everything we can economically, politically, the way we vote, the way we spend our money, anything we can do to support Israel. And of course, we remember that besides for physical support, there's also spiritual support. When we say an extra prayer, we give extra charity if they're married, we put on tefillin, mezuzah, all these things create an extra conduit of blessing, and we should do that as well. And very importantly, to speak up. But unfortunately, speaking up is not enough. Speaking up is not enough. Now, one of the most unfortunate and painful realities of this mutation of anti-Semitism is when Jews join. The reality is today that there are Jews that are joining these ranks, especially in the youth. And this is extremely concerning to us because when Jews join the ranks, it adds a tremendous amount of legitimacy and cover for the anti-Semitic attacks. When an anti-Semite attacks Israel and you say you're being anti-Semitic, he says, what do you mean? I have this Jew and that Jew that's saying exactly the same thing. And so we're going to spend a moment to figure out why are Jews joining and what we can do about it. So the first thing we have to do is to distinguish between two forms of anti-Semitism. And that is Purim anti-Semitism, which Purim anti-Semitism does not allow for Jews to join the anti-Semitism. But then there's another anti-Semitism called the Hanukkah Anti-Semitism. What's the difference between the Purim and the Hanukkah forms of anti-Semitism? In the Purim anti-Semitism, Haman wants to kill all the Jews. Which Jew is going to join Haman in trying to kill all the Jews? The same thing as with the Nazis. Which Jew is going to join the Nazis in killing all the Jews? Doesn't happen. Jews would never join it. But there's another form of anti-Semitism, which is the Hanukkah anti-Semitism. The Hellenistic Syrian Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes, who ruled between 175 and 164 BCE, he wanted to introduce into Israel Hellenism. Hellenism, one of their main beliefs was in the perfection of the human body. And so he wanted to introduce gymnasium and the rational mind as the primary mode of seeing reality into education. And when he was trying to tell Jews to stop behaving Jewishly, he said, I'm not anti-Semitic. You could continue being Jews, except for the parts that are backwards, except for the parts that I don't agree with. And many Jews joined Antiochus in this goal because they felt we also want Judaism to progress and move forward. So we have to cleanse Judaism and we have to fix Jews that are thinking in backwards ways. And then Jews will finally be accepted in the larger world. Until Jews cleanse themselves of their despicable parts of their religion, such as circumcision, or Shabbos, which makes the Jews look lazy, we won't be accepted by other people. And so we have to cleanse ourselves. And this kind of anti-Semitism, unfortunately, many Jews do join those kinds of anti-Semitism, and they don't see it as anti-Semitic. They think they're joining the club, the future, and they want to help Judaism and Jews move into that club. And it's put together so nicely in text 4 by Deborah Horn. Barbara, can you read for us text 4 on page 91?
Hanukkah anti-Semitism doesn't demand dead or expel Jews, at least not at first. Instead, it demands the destruction of Jewish civilization. This process requires not dead Jews, but Jews who are willing to give up whatever specific aspect of Jewish civilization is deemed to be uncool. Of course, Judaism has always been uncool, which is why cool people find it so threatening, and why Jews who are willing to become cool are absolutely necessary to Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism's success. In the days of Antiochus, this type of anti-Semitism needed those boys who voluntarily underwent painful genital surgery to prove that Jews weren't the problem, just the barbarity of Jewish law. Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism always promises Jews a kind of nobility, offering them the opportunity to cleanse themselves of whatever the people around them happen to find revolting. The Jewish traits designated as repulsive vary by country and time period, but they invariably contradict the specific values that the surrounding culture has embraced as universal. Thanks to Judaism's inherent uncoolness, there will never be a shortage of Jews willing to comply.
So while a neo-Nazi group might be revolted at a Jew joining their ranks, a Antiochus anti-Semite would be happy if a Jew joins its ranks. It gives it a cover of legitimacy and says, I don't hate Jews. I just hate the way this important part of Judaism is being practiced. Let's cut out and cleanse different parts of Judaism, and in every era it has its mutation. So there was a Jewish Communist Party, Yevsekia, that went out of its way to cleanse Jews of any part that wasn't consistent with the communistic ideals. So they got rid of the cheters, the Jewish schools, tried to close down the mikvahs, whatever thing they could do to cleanse Judaism of its moral ills, and it changes from time to time. So today, in progressive circles, in extreme progressive, they see this vision where the West is an imperialist, oppressive regime that exploits disadvantaged indigenous peoples and racial minorities. So Israel, since it was created by the British mandate, is a form of colonialism, and it's a part of imperialist racial ideology, so which is why it has to be dismantled. And you'll say, okay, but what about Jewish rights? Don't you stand up for Jewish rights? They'll say, yeah, we stand up for Jewish rights, but not at the expense of Palestinian rights. And Palestinians have a right from sea to sea, from the river to the sea, and Judaism has no right to that. And you'll say, what about the Jewish people's right to statehood and nationhood? They'll say maybe Jews don't deserve a state, or whatever their claims are. And we don't really have to get into the ideology so much now, but the reality is that it's very easy for a Jew who believes in these cool things and to be swept up and say, being cool and being Jewish are coming in conflict. So I'll rather identify with the cool guys, especially I don't have to renounce Judaism. I see myself as saving Judaism, and it's part of a sophisticated worldview. So that's why it's so appealing. And this would be very, very painful even if the anti-Israel movement applied its resources even-handedly amongst all, imperialist regimes. It becomes especially more painful when the anti-Israel movement applies it with such a double standard to Israel. So it becomes extremely more painful when Jews join this movement. And now the question is, what can Jews do about it?
Rabbi, I didn't understand the comment about Antiochus. Maybe I misunderstood it, about the voluntary painful genital surgery. Is there something I'm supposed to know about that I don't?
There were some Jews that were embarrassed that they were circumcised. So they went through a special grafting surgery to make themselves look like they were uncircumcised, just to fit in with their Gentile neighbors, their Gentile uncircumcised neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
is that what they're referring to? They considered that
yes.
a painful surgery? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to ask you another question about that.
Go ahead.
I am kosher, and in my community where I am, and even out there, I'm out there in the market, so to speak. If I mention to anyone that I'm kosher, the negativity that I receive from Jews is unreal. I would tell you that in my experience, which isn't much, but in my experience out there, I get more criticism from Jews because I'm kosher than I do from non-Jews. It's embarrassing, actually. I'm embarrassed to tell people. Now, I don't mean it in the way, I'm not a person who gets embarrassed, but you don't want to use your kosher lifestyle as a sword. It's no one's business, right? I actually find myself, embarrassed to tell Jewish people that I'm kosher. They consider me Orthodox. I have no idea what that word means. Not to say I wouldn't mind being Orthodox. I'm just saying to you that
two things. Number one, first of all, I can definitely relate. I definitely, as is always known, rabbis get more respect from the Goyim than from Yidden, from Jews. It's a fact. Fine. And number two, the Code of Jewish Law actually starts off. The first paragraph is important. The first thing you have to know as a Jew is not to develop a thick skin towards scoffers. That's the opening of Code of Jewish Law, because there'll always be parts of Jewish law that in different eras will be uncool. And it keeps on changing and shifting. And you say, okay, I cut out this, and then the next thing you have to cut out something else. And as we shared the story last week or 2 weeks ago, Rabbi Twersky, someone came to him on the bus and he says, you Jews are dressing, it was a Jew, came to him and attacked him for his religious garb. And he said, what are you talking about? I'm Amish. He says, oh, I apologize. You're so remarkable how you keep to your traditions and your old ways. Jews have been bullied for being uncool. And one of the ways of getting rid of it, they think, is by becoming more cool. And then finally we'll be accepted. And we know it's definitely not the case. So one of the classic response, yes, Joe.
I just, first of all, I consider myself a cool Jew, and I keep kosher, and I go to shul sometimes on Shabbos, and I do a lot of other things, and I'm still cool. And I've had the opposite experience of Barbara. When I sit down to eat with somebody, if I have my kosher food and they want to order something else, they actually defer to me and say, do you mind if I have my bacon and eggs or whatever? And if I said yes, they wouldn't have the bacon and eggs. I never say anything because I don't consider myself the Dayan of anybody else's life. But secondly, the whole concept of Matisyahu Jews, of Antiochus and things like that. First of all, Antiochus created laws that actually killed Jews for doing certain things. That was number one. The Jews that were the Hellenists weren't forcing Jews to do anything, yes or no. It was Antiochus that was forcing people. Historically, the Matisyahu and the Hasmoneans actually were the ones that incited the war with the Hellenists. And they're the ones that incited this whole rebellion and dragged the Hellenists into it. The Hellenists were like the Benonies. You know, I do what I want. I'm Jewish. I could go to the gym nude. I could go to the naked gym, and I could do all these kinds of things, which is what they did. You know, but you do what you want. I do what I want.
It wasn't so much you do what you want, because they had the belief that they wanted it to be in Jerusalem. In other words, they weren't like, let us make our own city where we'll do what we want. They wanted it to be, you know, in the temple. You know, the temple should be more Hellenistic.
Well, Antiochus actually defiled the temple, but just my main point that I wanted to make is today we have some very big supporters of Israel. The biggest supporters of Israel, probably more than the Jews, are the evangelists. And yet the evangelists are, by all definitions, anti-Semites in the traditional form of Antiochus. They want to get rid of the Jews, actually. Their whole reason for supporting Israel is because when 144,000 Jews go back to Israel, Jesus will come down and will save everybody, supposedly. And that's why they want Israel. They want us to convert. That's
very important comment you're making, and that will be part of our topic in next week. Will be an important conversation about that. Very good point that you're bringing up. Excellent. Okay, so one of the main reactions is like, okay, so many Jews are joining this movement. Let us respond by telling them of the true facts. You know, so what are the common arguments that people make for the right of Jews to be in the land of Israel? So take a moment to reflect. Some of you don't even need a moment. You have this on the tip of your tongue. But what are everyone suggest one thing, and so Joe, we'll start with you. One thing that you think is the right, you know, what's the right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel?
Jews have continuously been in Israel for the last 5,000 years. It's our homeland. We've always been there. We've never left it.
Very good. Anyone have anything else to add to this? To, you know, extra support?
In the Bible, the biblical claim.
Okay, the biblical claim. Very good. Genya? The mic.
Biblically, God promised that no matter what, I will always take you back to the homeland. And this is not a reason why the homeland really belongs to us, but I really do believe that every country, every nation has a homeland, and the Jews don't. I mean, if it's not Israel, where are we to go? So this gives us stability, especially after the Holocaust. But it's more so biblically.
Okay, and anyone else have any other support for the legitimacy of Israel?
Well, I would say that in terms of the biblical is numero uno, but then you have the actions of the other nations who persecute our people. So we need a homeland. I mean, look at all the Arab countries after Israel was established. All the Jews had to leave, even if they didn't want to. Syria, Egypt, Iraq, all the Libya, all the Jews, Tunisia, had to leave.
And any other additional points? Joe, go for it.
Yeah, we also bought our houses there. We didn't just come in and take it over. First of all, going back to the Bible, Abraham paid for Morat HaMachpelah, the cave of Machpelah. But even today, I was in Israel. The last time I was in Israel, we went to this moshav that was started by the Hashomer HaTzair, the young watchers, and he talked about the history of this kibbutz. And the history of the kibbutz started where a group of the Shomer HaTzair came out and they negotiated with the Arab guy that owned the land, and they paid him X amount of whatever shekels to buy the land. And then the next day he came with a whole bunch of other Arabs to kill them and take the land back and keep the money. But they prevailed. And that's Israel's, the modern Israel. Israel took the land by legitimate means and prevailed against the illegitimate means of other nations and other indigenous people, Palestinians and other Arabs, to take it back from them. So it's their land. It's like if somebody came to my house and said, I'm taking the house because I lived here. It's mine. No, I bought this house. It's my house. You can't have it. Israel bought it. And by any legal definition, this is the Jews' land in Israel.
Yeah. So let's just go through and everyone basically mentioned all these points, but let's go in slowly. So the common arguments that are made in support of Israel, the most common, except for you introduced the fourth point, which we're going to get into soon. But the one is the idea of international law. Israel has a strong basis in international law. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration of the British government has stated that His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This declaration was incorporated into the British Mandate for Palestine, which was issued by the League of Nations, the predecessor to the UN, in 1922. So basically, the nations of the world gave British the authority to establish in Israel, in Palestinian Mandate, the land of Israel, for the express purpose of creating a homeland for the Jewish people. In 1947, the United Nations approved a partition plan giving part of the land to the Jewish people. The Arabs did not accept this compromise, but the Jews did. So the Jews have the backing of the international community for the right to have a homeland in Israel. Next, Jewish survival is an important argument. One of the main motivations of the Zionist movement was Jews were constantly being attacked, not just by anti-Semites as people, but by nations, by governments who were not protecting the Jewish people. And so Israel was seen as a solution to this, where Jews would protect themselves. And after these 2,000 years of persecution, finally have safety. And then when the Holocaust happened, it sped up the urgency of this need for Jews to protect themselves. And finally, third argument is history. Jews have always been living in the land of Israel, as Joe mentioned. And although the numbers have fluctuated, Jews have never left. The smallest amount of Jews in Israel was a few thousand, but there was always a few thousand. And it's a continual presence from the times the Jews entered the first time, almost 3,000 years ago. So the hunch is that these are going to work. These are going to convince. But as we know from any Shabbat meal that we might have had with Jews who are on the opposing side, you'll see that these claims don't really land. They just slide off as if they're anti-water resistant, they just bounce off. And there's many counter arguments for this. And we're going to quote a prominent American Jewish critic of Israel who seeks to dismantle the Jewish state, God forbid. And though she doesn't mention it in this op-ed, we're going to take a look at this op-ed and you'll see where these claims fall short and why they don't necessarily work. So let's get a volunteer. Ken, if you can read for us on page 94, text 5.
Sure. Turned off by colonialism. When I was a Jewish kid growing up in suburban Los Angeles, we thought being Jewish meant supporting Israel. There really wasn't a choice. If you identified as Jewish, as I and most of my friends did, the religious education we got, the youth groups we joined, and the summer camps where we played, all grounded in one thing. It wasn't God, it was Zionism. the political project of settling Jewish people in Israel. My own break with Zionism came in my mid-20s after reading the letters of Zionism's founder, Theodore Herzl, imploring Cecil Rhodes, the leader of the British Land Theft in Africa, to support his work in Palestine. Their projects were both something colonial, Herzl assured Rhodes.
Okay, so Phyllis Bennis was raised in an atmosphere of strong support for Israel, and it doesn't endure because she says, this is not God's invention. This is really another branch of colonialism, and I want to have nothing to do as part of that. I'm a believer in tikkun olam, in justice, in correcting the world. Colonialism is the opposite of what's justice and right, where the mighty take over the indigenous weak, and Israel is just a further project of that. So when you hold up international law, they'll say, I don't care about international law. International law was made by colonialists. It was made by people who had no moral authority to give that land to the Jewish people. And then when you say, well, what about Jewish survival? They'll say, yeah, but that shouldn't come at the expense of Palestinians. Let them go get a land somewhere else. Let a part of the Sahara Desert be given to Jews where nobody lives. It shouldn't be given in Palestinian land. And then when you mention history, the historical claims, they'll say the fact that you ruled the land for thousands of years doesn't mean that you have the right for eternity. You don't have the right for eternity. Things change. You used to be the power of the land, but now you're not. And the fact that you have some land there, okay, so you can live as a minority under another power. You don't have the right to now restore as if nothing happened in the past 2,000 years of exile and just pop up one day and we're reestablishing the kingdom of David and the kingdom of Judah and Israel in middle of 20th century. You have no right to do that. No nation has a right to do that. Every nation has been through many kings, and you just don't have the right to power grab like that. So that's where although we could debate what's the flaws in their argument, in their counter arguments, and there are many flaws to it, but as we explained last time, when you have a perspective, a worldview, anything that contradicts that worldview, there's a self-sealing effect, where anything that contradicts your worldview, you're part of the colonialists if you're supporting Israel. So you have no legitimacy to tell me, to even debate with me. I can't even have a discussion with you because the fact that you're defending Israel proves that you have no moral compass. That's the frame how they see it. So you can't even get into a legitimate discussion and debate. So what is the solution? And the solution is exactly what we try to do is education, but we have to make sure we focus our education in the right place. Just educating on the facts, on these facts that we mentioned, which are very prominent themes and are important to know, have it in your arsenal. But just these facts alone are not enough. There's a story of there's a nice summary here. So the counter arguments, when you see you have international law, they'll say the declaration is immoral. When you say Jewish survival, they'll say, well, why the land of Israel specifically? Why that geography? When you say history, you'll say the history doesn't generate eternal right to the land. Okay, so obviously,
why do you have to look at those three things discreetly? Those three things together make up a very powerful argument that's impossible to argue against.
They won't argue.
Together.
They see an injustice happening to the Palestinian people, and so that's their key frame of reference. The fact that cohesively it looks like a perfect puzzle, they'll just nib at each argument on its own. They'll say each argument on its own doesn't stand. So the fact that together they interact, the fact that you have historical, that's why you need the land of Israel. And Israel is the place for your survival, and it's backed by international law. So it is solid, but it just won't be effective if you try to educate them in this way. So education is important. And, there's a story where someone wrote to the Rebbe, and he was horrified at what he witnessed. What did he witness? There was a Jew who came to Shul on Yom Kippur because they needed him for a minyan. He was the 10th man, but what did he do the whole day in Shul on Yom Kippur? He was reading a newspaper. And so one of the congregants, I don't know why he decided to write to the Rebbe. I don't know what the context of this letter, but he wrote lambasting this Jew. How could a Jew sit in Shul on Yom Kippur reading the newspaper? And the Rebbe said, I actually see a most beautiful thing about this Jewish person. This Jewish person could have stayed home. And yet there was something in him, some fire that was burning, that was saying, I'm going to be there to help the Jewish community have a minyan. It's just this flame that every Jew has within needs to be fed and needs to be fueled. And that part of that fuel is education. And if only, instead of canceling him and saying, you don't belong in a shul because you read the newspaper, we just have to nourish his flame and give it the right room to flourish into a warmth and radiant light. And that will help him appreciate Yom Kippur. You can't expect someone who doesn't know about Yom Kippur or appreciate Yom Kippur to accept Yom Kippur. And the same thing is how we have to look at all Jews involved in this movement. It's very important not to cut them off, God forbid, and to know that they are Jews at heart and they have that inner flame. And we do have to just educate them in the right way to see things from the right reference point. And when you see things from the right reference point, it helps a lot. So the Rebbe wrote to him in the letter, had he received a proper Jewish education, his flame could have been nurtured. And the same thing we can argue today is that there is something wrong about the education that they received. And you'll say, what do you mean? They went to youth groups where they were taught about the importance of Israel, right? Phyllis Bennis, text 5. She wrote, the religious education we got, the youth groups we joined, and the summer camps where we played were all grounded in one thing. It was Zionism. So clearly she did have a rich education on Zionism, but it wasn't full-featured enough. And so we're going to spend a few minutes on an important part of education that has been woefully neglected in our times. And that will hopefully people see the world through the right lens. And I feel like I'm looking into the glasses straight into Bruce Lev's living room right now. Okay, fine. So Jews who are battling with Israel, they have a neshama, and what do they need to hear? So what's important to remember is that we're okay with the Jew being anti-colonialism. Maybe we're okay with it, as long as it's rooted in Torah, as long as it's part of Torah. If you study Torah and you came to the realization that colonialism is wrong based on your study, your honest, sincere study of Torah, fine. But it's a shame when your value system comes from slogans heard on late night television and seen on social media. If that's where your values come from, then that's a problem. And unfortunately today, most young Jews and some Jews, they don't get their values from Torah. Their values come from late night hosts and social media. So we need to learn, and the same thing applies to us. When we're teaching about Israel, it's very important that the foundation is a Torah-based foundation. So we're going to spend a few minutes to learn what is that Torah-based foundation, and that Torah-based foundation brings strength to the three arguments that we supported earlier, and we'll see why. So one of the famous, for those that are in the Torah world, know that the Torah is a book of instruction and guidance. It's not a history book. It's a book of guidance. So you say, no, what do you mean? Torah is a history book. It starts off with the creation of the world. What does the creation of the world tell me in the 20th century? I don't have any plans to create a new world. Why do I have to know that God created the world? How's that moral guide? What does that tell me? And yet the Torah starts off with the historical account of the creation of the world. So let's read text 6, which addresses why the Torah starts off with the creation of the universe instead of starting off from the first mitzvah, which the first mitzvah to the Jewish people is in Exodus. The Torah could have started from there, or maybe mentioned that Adam had the 6 laws, or food, be fruitful and multiply. Why did it have to start with the creation story? So for text 6, we'll ask Stan. Stan, if you can read for us text 6 on page 95.
Responsive opening. Rabbi Yitzchak stated the Torah should have begun with the first mitzvah commanded to the Jewish people, which is contained in the verse. This month shall be to you, etc. For what purpose does it start with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth? The solution is found in the verse. He recounted the strengths of his works to his people, to give them the inheritance of nations. In other words, if the nations of the world accuse the Jews with the claim, you are thieves for having conquered the lands of the 7 nations, the Jews should reply, the entire world is God's. He created it and granted it to whomever he desired. It was his will to initially give it to the 7 nations, and it was his will to subsequently remove it from them and give it to us.
Okay, this is the opening commentary of Rashi, the most famous Torah commentary. He says the whole reason for the Genesis account is to count this, to denounce this argument. People say, what right do Jews have to the land of Israel? They are thieves, they steal our land. God says, I created the world, and I choose who I want to live where, and I choose for the Jewish people to live there. And this promise to Abraham has been repeated many, many times, as we'll read in text 7, the first of many times in the Torah that this promise is reiterated. So Stan, if you can also read for us text 7, and then you'll ask us the question afterwards.
Okay. God told Avram, raise your eyes and look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever.
Okay, so this promise was repeated numerous times to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Moses, to the Jewish people. It was reiterated many times. So that is our right to the land. And the fact that we have been kicked out of our land doesn't take away something that belongs to us. It belongs to us, and no one can take it away. And so from here we see, now, will this idea work on someone who wasn't educated to believe in the supremacy of Torah? If someone doesn't value Torah, this argument holds no water. So the first foundation is we have to educate our youth on the value, on the gift that Torah is for us, and the truth, the eternal truth of the Torah. And then there's no other claim. And you say, okay, what does this have to do with stopping anti-Israel activity? Well, first of all, many non-Jews also believe in the Bible. And many, many millions, billions of people believe in the Bible. And what's most important is we're not necessarily convinced the haters, but at least we can convince the Jewish people over time of their right to the land.
Rabbi,
yes, Dan.
This was brought up when I brought in the 2 coins. I brought in a coin from Roman times where they were celebrating the capture of Israel. And I brought in a coin mocking that, an Israeli coin showing the liberation of Israel. So one was from when it was taken, and one was when it was liberated.
Okay. And Stan, you wanted to make a comment?
There are people that are atheist and agnostic and have no belief in God. So for someone who has that kind of a foundation, this is not an explanation, nor is it something that they would consider legitimate.
That's right. That's right. And many Jews do consider themselves atheists. And that is a flaw, I believe, of Jewish education. Parents have just assumed that what we believe will pass on to our children automatically. And the reality is that's not the case. And in a way, Jews, if they don't have a strong Jewish education, are more likely to be atheists than children of any other religion. It just, as the joke goes, that the general was giving dog tags. The captain was giving dog tags to the soldiers in his unit. And he says, McConnell, what religion are you? He's Protestant. Smith, what religion? Catholic. Muhammad, what religion are you? Islam. Davidson, what religion are you? Says, well, religion depends what you define religion and what do you mean by God and this and that. Captain says, Jewish, just the hesitation and the uncomfortability with, that is a Jewish feature. So you say, okay, so why is this argument important? Okay, it's not going to work for the atheists of the world, and we can't educate the whole world. We could try, but somewhere where we could try is to educate the Jewish people on the value of Torah. And this is it's a hard battle, but it's an important battle to have. And the Rebbe had a correspondence with the president of Israel and Zalman Shazar, and that was a point he made in the letter, text 8. Who should read for us text 8? Bruce, read for us text 8.
I have received complaints. Why do I invoke the biblical land of Israel, the Holy Land, and the covenant with Abraham in connection with modern Israel? Why do I mix God into the picture? After all, they say, those who fought for the creation of the state, those who led it, those who currently direct it, and its authorized representatives, they all proclaim and take pains to emphasize that Israel is a state founded in 1948. My answer, put frankly, is that their narrative is false. No new entity was created in 48. Rather, that was the year in which a large part of the land of Israel was liberated. An entity established in 1948 based on the agreement or authorization of the nations of the world has no strength or justification in terms of an authentic response to the claim. You are thieves for having conquered lands belonging to others, etc., a claim raised by the Arabs, the Vatican, the United Nations, and some Jews as well. This is why it is so crucial to underscore that it is our God-given homeland. Now, I do not delude myself into imagining that these just and honest arguments will prevail in the United Nations, the Vatican, etc. Nevertheless, transmitting this truth is critical for the morale of Jewish youth living in the Holy Land, including those serving in the IDF, for Jewish American students, and for the Jewish youth of other countries as well.
Okay, so that ending of the letter I find so important. That can you imagine a soldier fighting to defend Israel, but then when he goes on social media and he hears that, well, look at Israel is causing suffering to the Palestinian people, and now think of the morale of the soldiers. Now they have hesitancy whether what they're doing is right. Are they fighting for a just cause, or are they fighting for an immoral cause? But if you educate the people in Israel on the basis of Torah, so you say this land is eternally the Jewish people, and we're just liberating land that was always ours. It was given to us by God, and no one that kicks us out of our land can take that away from us. So the Rebbe felt that although the founders of the state of Israel may have been atheist or secular, it would be a mistake for the government not to it would be very important and vital for Israel's future to bring more Torah-based education into the Israeli education system. And there's a story that actually for a long time Israel did not have any Torah ideas in their education system. No mitzvot, it was like cut out completely. They wanted to divorce Israel from Judaism for whatever reason. And the way it changed has nothing to do with this letter from the Rebbe. What actually changed it was that the Maccabee basketball team was playing in Russia. And it was a very famous game where teeny Israel beat Russia. And it gave Israel a big sense of pride. And that Shabbat is, someone can look up on Wikipedia the details of this game. I think there's a documentary of this game, the amount of pride that it gave Israel that they won Russia in this cup. And what happened is that Shabbat, they made a Shabbat gathering, and the star athlete was called up to the Torah, and he didn't know how to make the blessings on the Torah. And the minister of education in Israel witnessed that. He's like, wow, how could the representative, where are you seeing pride of the Jewish people? And now what does it look like that he can't even make a blessing on the Torah? So that's kind of how more and more Judaism is seeping its way into the Israeli education system. But it's very important, especially us that don't live in Israel, that we set this strong foundation of Torah education. Yes, Ken.
Me?
You wanted to ask something? Joe.
I do. The team was an Israeli team. They don't know how to read Hebrew. I don't understand that. What do they don't teach them how to read in school?
I don't know. He was butchering the blessing. Maybe they didn't have a text. They expected him to know it by heart. I don't know.
I assume everyone in Israel learns how to read for one reason or another. It's the language.
Could be an immigrant to Israel.
I digress, but the Yeshiva University right now has the longest running basketball streak at 39. I'm sure they all know how to do the blessings at Yeshiva, at YU.
Congratulations.
They're playing Wednesday night again, if anybody wants to watch the game online.
Hey, Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, you're right. Some of the members of the Israeli Maccabi team are not Israeli. At one point, you had Amari Stoudemire playing for Maccabi in Israel. Amari Stoudemire used to play for the Knicks. He's a black son of a Jew, son of a Jewish woman, so which makes him Jewish, and he discovered his Judaism late in life. So it's possible that a Jew might not know the blessings. I also had a guide in Israel, by the way, that was totally Israeli, totally Jewish, born in Israel, bred in Israel, was a Sabra, and he had trouble with the blessings of my son's bar mitzvah to all. So it happens. They're not used to saying it, and they're not used to singing it. But that's not what I wanted to just say. I understand the intellectual discussion we're having right now in terms of various things we could say to what I consider the illogical anti-Semite, but I think what the Israeli army does is probably the best answer for anybody that questions the existence of the state of Israel. They have their graduation ceremony for their recruits on Masada, and they go through a whole story about what happened at Masada, and they follow that up with what happened in the Holocaust, and they imbue in the soldier the knowledge that if not for Israel now, that they're fighting for their own lives, because they would be ripped apart if not for Israel. The world's Jews would be ripped apart if not for Israel. And really, they're fighting for the lives of Jews all over the world. So you want to get rid of Israel? Fine. If you're a Jew that wants to get rid of Israel, you're essentially committing suicide.
But you should know that I've seen, I've gotten into discussions. I usually don't argue back, but they when I make the claim of Jewish survival, why Israel is so important for Jewish survival, they say it's actually done. It actually hurts Jewish survival. You put the Jewish people in middle of such a dangerous territory. Of course, it's going to be a never-ending conflict, which hurts the Jews that live in Israel, and it also hurts the Jews that live everywhere else, which have to defend this constant conflict. So I'm not trying to legitimize their claim. I'm just saying the reality is this doesn't land with them either. They debate, no, it's not best for Jewish survival. It's better if a Jew lives in California or lives in Chile, Argentina, Australia. These are much better places for a Jew to live than in the dangerous land of Israel. So I'm not trying to make a claim that if
the dispersion of the Jewish people, as opposed to the concentration of the Jewish people, whether they're religious Jews, secular Jews, or whatever, the concentration of Jews is the strength of the Jews. The dispersion of the Jews was meant to destroy the Jews.
They'll say, if we're dispersed, no one can wipe us out because no one controls the whole world. If we're all in one place, then one nuclear bomb or whatever can destroy all Jews. Yeah. So the benefit, so the idea here that we're trying to, if we have the strong foundation, in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. It is God's world. He chose to give a piece of it to us. This gift is eternal, whether we're kicked out of it or not. It belongs to us, right? So Jewish education has to have this foundation. Torah and God are exciting, relevant, and meaningful. If we do not educate our children with this building block, with this foundation, it's very easy for a Jew to end up as a proud BDS supporter and support the anti-Semites. They don't even realize that they're supporting anti-Semitism. Now, on top of that is another brick, is Israel education, the importance of Israel and how it helps us. And that will result in less anti-Israel activity by Jews, which will weaken the whole argument that anti-Semites can make to say, we're not anti-Semites, look, we have Jews on our side. So there's a strong correlation with us giving a strong foundation that Torah and God are exciting, relevant, and meaningful, which can lead to a reduction in anti-Semitism. But now we're going to go a little bit deeper, and this is an important thing. Now, if you enjoy the class till now, you can actually, we could put a pause here, we could end the lesson here. But I do want to spend 10 minutes to actually take it a little deeper, because I find the next part very meaningful. But if it goes over your head, don't worry about it. We learned a lot of good ideas tonight already. But here's the question, and this is a little, I love this, but it's Talmudic kind of question. There's a principle in Torah, and that is, if the Torah answers a question, it means the question is legitimate. It's wrong. It's a wrong in the final conclusion, but there's legitimacy to it. And so the rabbinic discussion around this commentary that says that God started, the Torah starts off with the description of the creation of the world to answer the claim of those that say we stole the land. They say the fact that the Torah has to address it proves that there's something legitimate to it. What is legitimate about the claim that Jews stole this land? What is legitimate about this claim? And that's what we're going to spend the next 8 minutes on. This idea that the fact that the Torah addresses it proves that there's some legitimacy to the claim that we steal the land. Okay, so on the surface, the question is, why should the Jews claim ownership of this land? And we already know the answer. Well, God created the world and he gives us the land. He chooses what he wants to do with his world. But the deeper question is, why should the Jews claim ownership of this physical land if Jewish identity is rooted in the Torah's spiritual practice? In other words, there's something that the nations of the world can't understand. What does Judaism need a land for? One of the miracles of the Jewish people is that they've survived 2,000 years outside of the land of Israel. In other words, the nations of the world are wondering, does Judaism need a land to survive? Why did God give land to the Jewish people? They don't need it. They could have been given a set of guiding principles how to live their lives, and they could have lived it in America and in Europe and in Israel, wherever they want. Why did God give a physical land to the Jewish people? What purpose does it serve? What is the purpose? As Reb Sadia Gaon famously quotes in text 9, Umasenu b'nei Yisrael einei umma ela b'teiraseha. The key secret to Jewish survival, and there have been many suggestions, we're smart, humorous, whatever. Reb Sadia Gaon says the Jewish nation is only a nation through its Torah. It is the guiding principles of Torah that has kept us strong. When Jews stayed close to Torah, the Torah protected them. And and vice versa. You know, the Torah needs the Jewish people as well. We protect the Torah and the Torah protects us. So what do we need a land for? Why should Torah, so the question we're addressing here is, why should Torah dignify the nations with an answer? And isn't it odd for the Torah to begin with this, with a rebuttal to anti-Semites? It's so strange, but now we're learning the deep reason. The Torah is giving us a hint of somehow the land of Israel is so important to Judaism. And that's why the Torah has to start off with this. Because the nations of the world correctly know that Jews don't need a land to survive as a Jewish people. We've survived 2,000 years without a land. So why does God give us a land? You know, other nations are bound by geography. If you're French, as you're French because you were born in France or your parents were born in France. 10 generations later, if you don't live in France, your kids are not going to identify as French. They'll identify as whichever nation they live in. So most nations of the world have survived by their geography. But the Jewish nation has survived by their connection to the divine document, the Torah. So why indeed does the Torah tell us that God gave us the land of Israel? Let's read text 10 and text 11. So we'll divide this. We'll split it into two. Steve Ender, are you ready to read for us text 10?
Yes, you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. An objective, unprejudiced survey of the long history of our people will at once bring to light the reality that our survival as a nation was not the result of material wealth or physical strength. Even during the most prosperous times under the united monarchy of King Solomon, the Jewish people, as well as its country, were materially insignificant by comparison with contemporary world empires such as Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia. Nor was it our active statehood or the control of our geographical homeland that secured our existence. As is evident from the reality that for the vast majority of history, our people have lived in exile, without a kingdom and without a homeland. Similarly, our Hebrew language did not play a vital role in our perpetuation. For even in biblical times, Aramaic supplanted the Holy Tongue as a spoken language, to the extent that parts of the scripture, almost all of the Babylonian Talmud, the Zohar, and other key works were composed in Aramaic instead of Hebrew. Later in the times of Rabbi Sadagan and Maimonides, most of the Jewish masses spoke Arabic, and further down the line, it was Yiddish and other languages. It is also possible to ascribe any common secular culture or contemporary scientific knowledge, such as the major preservation factor for a people, since such material morphed radically from one era to the other. The only remaining consideration, which is the sole factor that has remained consistent throughout the ages, in all lands and under the fullest diversity of circumstance, is the Torah and the mitzvah that the Jews have observed in their daily life with great self-sacrifice.
Okay, and if we can jump right away to the next text, Bradley, are you available to read for us? Okay, Genya, read for us text 11, page 104.
The Lay of the Land by the Rebbe Menachem Mendel Schneerson. The response to this is that the relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel is unique. It is not comparable to the relationship between any other nation and its homeland. Rather, the Jewish land is an integral part of the Jewish people's spiritual mission. The ultimate goal of the Jewish people's divine service is to turn this tangible world into a home for godly revelation, to the point that God's holiness dwells specifically in the physical reality of this world. For this reason, the majority of the Torah's commandments involve physical activities, so that the fulfillment of Torah and mitzvot install sanctity into tangible materials. It was therefore critical to provide the Jews with the land of Israel, a physical land, and to provide them with an abundance of mitzvot that can be performed exclusively with this land. For this expresses the entire goal of the Jewish people and the purpose of the Torah, to conquer the physical dimension of the world and transform it into a home for God.
Okay, so in summary, you know, the Jewish people are different from typical nations that need a land to bind them together. What binds us together is the Torah. So people could have the conclusion, okay, so you're a religion. Religion doesn't need a land. But that's incorrect. Because one of the primary purposes of creation was God created a world that felt distant from God, that wasn't hospitable to divine awareness. And the Torah was supposed to be a light to reintroduce the world to God and to create a marriage between the physical world and the godly revelation. And therefore, God said, Jews, I don't just give you the Torah, I'm giving you a land where you'll implement this Torah. Well, you'll show that the values of Torah are not true in spiritual terms, but they're true in a physical, tangible way. So the land of Israel is our playground where the Jewish people are supposed to implement the values of the Torah in a real way, in a real society where people are doing business with each other and they have partnerships with each other. And sometimes the partnerships gets tensions and they have to negotiate conflict and they have to negotiate rules of the road and all these other things that a society needs to deal with. And then God's saying, that's where I want to feel at home. I don't want to feel at home only in the synagogue. I want to feel at home in your house when you're having a dinner. I want to feel at home on the roads. Wherever you go, when two businesses are fighting, do they fight in a Torah way? That means they go to the Beth Din or whatever the approach is. Everything should be in the model that the Torah represents. Now, we're far away from doing that, unfortunately, but that is the reason that God gave us the land of Israel, to implement this idea, the physical world together with godly revelation. So that is why the land of Israel is so important, because it demonstrates that the Jewish mission is compatible with the physical world. It's not, okay, to be Jewish, you have to shut yourself off from physicality and the realms. No, you have to have strong spiritual values that help you conquer the physical world.
So that, Rabbi, could I mention something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, that's all fine and good, and I totally am on the same page. But when you're dealing with people who don't see, I mean, that it's a very, very high level of thinking spiritually and Jewishly, but if you're dealing with, kids that don't believe in God, or like Jews that do believe in God, but yet they are very not anti, but Jews also feel like we should pull out of the West Bank, or just the whole conflict that's going on in Israel. It's a
So
very
that's what so you're right. It's very hard to start when someone's 50 years old, but when our kids get a strong appreciation for Torah and why Torah is relevant and God is relevant and meaningful, and their values are not based on late night hosts and Twitter, but they're based on Torah values, then you can have legitimate discussion. Should Israel be just in the West Bank or outside the West Bank or not? And already you're discussing within a Torah framework, so it's much easier. They have a certain confidence. But if they don't believe in the value of Torah, you're right.
But then,
So that's
but on another level, like if you do,
there's just one more important thing that we have to remember is that the Torah belief is that every Jew really believes in Torah in their core. It just, as they get more exposed to other ideas, their flame isn't nourished in the importance of Torah, then they they lose their way. And so our job is not to teach new ideas. Our job is just to fan the flicker that's a little dim ember in a coal, and you just have to fan it out and restore it to it. So the battle is not to teach them something new, it's really to help them uncover something that already exists. So that already makes the job easier.
No, absolutely. But some religious people who believe that we should just like let the whole idea of Israel being our homeland now pre the Messiah, because when the Messiah comes, it is going to be our home. So why are we so uptight? Why are we so obsessed with the land when we know we're going to get it when Mashiach comes?
Well, there's very few religious people that make that claim today. It's a question, it's like a couple having a debate about whether they should have another child or not, versus a debate after they have a child at 2 years old, whether they should kill him or not. It's a totally different debate. So while many religious Jews did disagree with a secular Israeli state, they felt that religion would be protected more by the British mandate than the secular Israeli state. But that was a discussion before the creation of Israel. Now that the creation of Israel, including the Satmar Rebbe, which many people frame him as anti-Zionist, was a strong supporter in his writings of the security for the Jews in Israel. So today, even though we don't see it as a replacement for Mashiach, some people believe that maybe Israel is a replacement for Mashiach, the foundation of the state of Israel. We don't need Mashiach anymore. So definitely religious Jews don't see it that way. Practicing Jews don't see it that way, but they do believe that millions of Jews are there, and any argument that is presented that weakens the legitimacy of state of Israel hurts Jews. It hurts Jews in Israel, and it hurts Jews around the world.
Thank you.
So let's conclude. So the Jewish mission is compatible with this. So let's conclude this final thought. And I know we're running 6 minutes over time, but with this, we're done. The main idea of Torah is that the Torah is God and the world are compatible. Although God created initially incompatible, but God gave us the mission to make it compatible. So you see over here 4 pictures of some leather, some candles, a ram, and some gold. What does this have to do with God? Comes the Torah and says, well, you have tefillin, you have Shabbat candles. All of these things are very godly things, giving charity. Money is not the root of, my grandfather was a waiter in a camp. And he put up a sign. I don't know if he put up the sign or someone, he was part of the waiter staff or something. There was a big sign in camp on visiting day that said, money is the root of all evil. So get rid of the evil, give all your evil to us. That was the waiters were trying to raise tips on visiting day. So the Rebbe came to visit camp, and he turned to my grandfather. He said, you guys should look into the source of that first half of the quote. And they looked into the source. Money is the root of evil is from Christian sources. It says in Judaism, money is not evil. Money is a tool. And the fact, according to the Midrash, why did God create gold? God created gold for the Mishkan. Now, gold was also used for the golden calf. Sure, gold could be used for destructive purposes, but it's not the root of all evil. It's just the choices that we make. And our job is to take the physical world and conquer it and show that it could be a home for God. So for that reason, that's why the Torah opens with it's important to know that although Judaism doesn't need a state to survive, Judaism needs a state to demonstrate the whole purpose of the world, to show the world how it is done and how they can use the 7 Noahide laws to build just societies in whichever countries they are in. And when Jews are proud and strong in Israel and behave as the Torah wants them to behave, that ends up inspiring the other nations of the world to live up to their potential as humans created in the image of God, to create just societies and to bring peace to the entire world with the coming of Mashiach. And we'll conclude with the lesson video. Whoops, I skipped the video. Give me a second.
Lesson 3, The Promised Land. 1. Anti-Semitism seeks legitimacy from the most prestigious authority of any given era. At present, this authority is the pursuit of human rights. Consequently, many of today's anti-Semites focus overwhelmingly on Israel and accuse it of being the ultimate violator of human rights. 2. When Israel is A, demonized, or B, judged with a double standard, or C, when Israel's existence is delegitimized, the challenge exposes itself as an expression of anti-Semitism. 3. When anti-Semites refrain from asserting that they seek to annihilate Jewry, but merely take issue with specific Jewish beliefs or practices, claiming them to be barbaric, Jews can be tempted to join the fight against their fellow Jews, believing that they are saving Jews rather than hurting them. 4. There are several arguments for why Jews need and have a right to Israel. Most crucial is the Torah's oft-reiterated reminder that God gave Jews the land of Israel as an eternal inheritance. The deeper our appreciation of this reality, and the more we educate the next generation about its implications, the more support we will nourish toward the land of Israel. Such an approach can desirably influence the wider audience, but the most vital audience is our Jewish brothers and sisters. 5. To support Torah and God-based reasoning, it is necessary to create an environment that cherishes the Torah and nurtures faith. It is therefore critical to provide a robust Jewish education to ourselves and to the next generation. 6. Jews are a nation not because of our land, but because of our Torah. Nevertheless, the land is important to the Torah's vision for the world, inasmuch as it embodies the Jewish mission on earth, to infuse physicality with holiness.
Okay, and I invite you for lesson 4, the concluding lesson, which is really important. There will be haters in the world. There will be, and how should we deal with them? What's the right model for a relationship with the haters? Do we denounce them? Do we cancel them? Do we cut them off? Do we engage in negotiations with them? What is the right, appropriate approach for those that hate us? And also, what is the right approach for those that maybe seem to love us, like the evangelicals? So we're going to discuss that all next week. I think one of the most important takeaways from this course will be presented next week. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for staying late. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Rabbi. Very good. Excellent.
Thank you, Rabbi. Very good today.
Excellent.
Shabbat shalom.
Hello.